Hey, okay, I'm going to do my assessment, and like I do every time, I'm going to go to my drive to find my screencast file, and well, it'll load eventually, I guess. Here it is, Screencast-O-Matic. Okay. At the top it says Screencast-O-Matic, and then it has a thank you to you. I really do want to thank you so much for allowing me to do this assignment late. If I would have had to do it the day that I left to go to the funeral, I probably wouldn't have got there to see family and just would have had to go to the funeral. So I'll be going over Chapter 1, Chapter 2, and Chapter 13. So I just want to say thank you again. Chapter 1, one of the first things that stood out to me is that it says, assessment is everywhere in schooling, sometimes hidden in plain sight. And you know, since I've taken this class, I can really look back and see that assessment really is everywhere in school. And even sometimes I didn't realize I was being assessed, but I was. Then it gave this example that I found very interesting and way too interesting to leave out of this screencast. So it says, Megan's educational assessment began in kindergarten with her interview and observation. On registration day, Megan and her mother came to school and were interviewed briefly. A teacher rated Megan's cognitive and social-emotional skills. Her development was judged normal, and she was attending kindergarten. During the year, she had difficulty paying attention to the teacher and participating in group activities. Although she was never aggressive nor hostile, she was given a readiness test at the end of kindergarten and performed as an average child. Her teacher recommended that she continue to the first grade, but her parents balked. They didn't think she was ready. They took her to a guidance clinic, requested further psychological assessment. The clinical psychologist administered an individual intelligence test and a projective test in which Megan was asked to tell a story about what was happening in each set of pictures. The psychologist interviewed her, her parents, and her teacher. The psychologist described her as a normal both in cognitive ability and social-emotional ability. Her parents withdrew her from the school she was attending and placed her in another school to repeat kindergarten. Later they reported that whereas her first experience was difficult for her, her second kindergarten year was a great success. In their view, a teacher who was particularly sensitive to Megan's needs helped her accelerate her cognitive development. By the end of the year, she had also become more confident and regularly participated in group activities. So, first thing when I read this, one of the first things I thought about is I specifically remember going in to get my testing for kindergarten. And then, there's some things down here that says things to gather from this example, but this example really hit home for me. I am the middle child. I have a younger brother and I have an older brother. And my older brother was Megan in this situation. They recommended that he go on to first grade. They said his cognitive and social emotional development was great, and that even though he had issues paying attention and that sometimes he wasn't there, that he would do fine. It was time for him to move on. And my mother tells me, she tells me the story, that she had a gut feeling telling her that her child needed to stay in kindergarten, but she didn't listen because just like Megan's parents, they went to the psychologist. Well, he did really awful in school and ended up not graduating high school. And when we targeted what happened, it was first grade that when we lost him. Now, my younger brother, he was Megan as well. He had issues paying attention. He had issues staying focused. He wasn't very confident. But once again, they said his cognitive and social emotional development was fine, and they told him that he was ready to go to first grade. And once again, my mother had that feeling that he needed to stay. And this year he stayed, and now my brother has a 4.0. He's top 10 in his class. And so I just thought that was cool to show that in my personal life, I've seen both sides of that. So I put next things to gather from this example. It says, although Megan's parents may have been right to have her repeat kindergarten, there's no way of knowing what would have happened if she would have gone straight to first grade because she didn't. Then I also noticed that both formal and informal assessments were administered. And the third thing I gathered was successful teachers obtain information about their students from high-quality assessments, and that's exactly what they did with Megan. Assessment and educational decisions about students. Assessments provide information for decisions about students, schools, curricula, and programs and educational policy. There's no simple answer to the question, is this a good assessment procedure? An assessment procedure may serve some type of decisions very well and others not so well. And I think that's something that we all need to know, that's not a question that we can just ask and know, because it just doesn't work that way. Instructional decisions. Teachers make decisions about student at the rate from every 2 to 3 minutes. I thought that was absolutely insane. And that was a statistic from Shavelson and Stern from 1981 in our book. That's about 20 decisions every class period, depending on how long the class period is. Sound assessment procedures gather sound information. Researchers estimate that the teacher may spend from 1/3 to 1/2 of their time in an assessment-related activity. And I think that's so awesome. To help you think about the many decisions a teacher must make, we have an organized set of questions a teacher must answer before, during, and after teaching. Assessments before beginning teaching. And I think this is so important that I actually typed this up and printed it out, so I'll have it one day in my future classroom. What content do I need to cover during the next week, month, marking period, and so on? What student abilities do I need to take into account as I plan my teaching activities? What materials are appropriate for me to use with this group of students? With what learning activities will my students and I need to be engaged as I teach the lesson? What learning objectives do I want my students to achieve as a result of my teaching? And how should I organize and arrange the students in the class with upcoming lessons and activities? I think it is so critical that you ask yourself those questions and you just don't just jump into something head first and think you know it all. Because I think regardless of how long you've been teaching and how long you've been doing something, sometimes you still might need to go back to that question. The decisions during your teaching is my lesson going well and are my students catching on? I think those are the top two. If my students aren't catching on, then there's no point in moving on. What should I do to make this lesson work better? And what feedback should I give each student about how well he or she is learning? And are my students ready to move on to the next activity in the learning sequence? And I actually just thought I would highlight this one because I remember so many times getting left behind in class because I wasn't ready to move on and she thought we were. And I've learned being in college and working in a school, like once you're behind, you're behind. There's no way of catching up. It's pretty hard. Decisions after teaching a student. How well are my students achieving the short and long-term instructional objectives? What strengths and weaknesses will I report to each student for his or her guardian or parent? What grade should I give each student for the lesson or unit, marking period, or course? How effectively did I teach this material to the students? And how effective are the curriculum and materials I use? Modeling learning expectations. Assessments serve examples for students by showing them what you want them to learn. You may teach students to identify the ways in which their current performance matches the expected performance and how remedy of deficiencies. And in my book it said good assessment equals good instruction. So it automatically made me think that bad assessment equaled bad instruction. So I feel as if I give good instruction to my students, then a good assessment is what I will get in return. Motivating students. Assessments may also motivate students to study. I know that when I had this assessment, I didn't just jump in and start typing and writing. I had to go through this chapter and I had to highlight my book and I had to say what I was going to talk about and see how I could make a connection with them. So this assessment absolutely motivated me to study. Part of my motivation was because I get a grade for this, but the other part was because I need to learn and one day this will affect my students and me. However, unfortunately, some teachers use this in a form of accountability as a weapon rather than a construction force or tool. This should help you, not hurt you. And I put that in all capital letters because when a teacher uses something as a weapon rather than a tool, it's hurting them, it's hurting the students, and it's just pointless at that point to me. Assigning grades to student. One of the most obvious reasons for giving classroom assessment is to help you assign grades to students. That's so obvious. You do something, you get a grade. I'll do this assessment that I'll submit, and then I'll get a grade. The grades that you report represent your summative evaluations or judgments about how well your students have achieved important learning goals. Do not use test scores alone to justify your grade. I think that's awesome. I didn't realize that it wasn't just test grades that I got. Right here I have the definition for selection decisions, placement decisions, and classification decisions. I'll just give you about a few seconds to look over this because I'm running out of time on my screencast and I still have so much awesome stuff to cover. Okay. Assessment results frequently assist students in exploring, choosing, and preparing for a career. Here are the guidelines for selecting and using classroom assessments. 1. You need to be clear about the learning objectives you want to assess. 2. You need to be sure that the assessment techniques you select match the learning goals. 3. You need to be sure that the selected assessment techniques serve the needs of learners. 4. Whenever possible, be sure to use multiple indicators of performance for each learning objective. And 5. Be sure that when you interpret or help students interpret the results of assessments, you take the limitations of such results into account. Test is an instrument or systematic procedure for observing and describing one or more characteristics of a student using either a numerical scale or a classification scheme, A, B, C, D, F. Measurement and evaluation, those are pretty obvious. Chapter 2 and 13. Chapter 1 had so much. So, a learning objective specifies what you would like students to achieve when they've completed an instructional segment. You need to 1. Decide on what the students are to learn, 2. Carry out the actual instruction, and 3. Evaluate the learning. Activity 1 required you to articulate in some way what you expect students to be able to do after you've taught them what you've taught them. Activity 2 is what they describe as the heart of teaching process itself. Here you provide the conditions and activities for students to learn. 3. You need to evaluate whether learning has occurred. This is a summative assessment. If learning has not occurred, then I personally would probably go back to before Activity 1 and reteach them. Before you design procedures to evaluate students' learning, you should have clearly in mind the students' performances you want to evaluate. If you are not clear on which important learning outcomes you want to evaluate, it's hardly possible to make a valid assessment of those outcomes. Statements of specific learning objectives are important for the following 4 aspects of classroom assessment: the general planning for an assessment procedure, selecting and creating an assessment procedure, evaluating an existing assessment procedure, and properly judging the content. It goes over in our book, which we go over in class. I'm working on 13 minutes. So, content standards, performance standards, common core state standards, and state standards. This is what we use right now. So, plus we have state standards, the Arkansas state standard. The taxonomies, I know you wanted me to get to that probably because it seems like it's one of your favorite. So, the cognitive domain, the affective domain, and the psychomotor domain. I had to actually look these up. I wasn't sure. The cognitive domain focuses on knowledge and abilities to acquire memory, thinking, and reasoning process. The affective domain focuses on feelings, interests, attitudes, dispositions, and emotional states. And the psychomotor domain, I literally couldn't even assume. It is objective focus on motor skills and perceptual processes. Bloom's taxonomy is knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And I'll go over those really quick. The knowledge is obviously the knowledge, what we've learned. Comprehension represents the lowest level of understanding. Application involves the use of abstractions, in particular in concrete situations, to solve new or novel problems. Analysis involves the breakdown of a communication into the constituent elements or parts, such as the relative hierarchy of ideas. Synthesis involves the putting together of elements and parts as to form a whole, and evaluation requires judgments about the value of materials and methods. I'm on 14 minutes and something seconds. Last thing I have is how to write specific learning objectives, and this was super important, I felt. You need to be student-centered, performance-centered, and or content-centered. And I think that's awesome that student-centered is one of the first one that pops up, because in my head it is all about the students. We're raising these children to be doctors, lawyers, teachers, stuff that's important. And with that, I'm so thankful that you've given me the opportunity to do this assignment late and to let you know how much I've learned. I really appreciated this assessment. It was the biggest one we've done so far, but I definitely feel like it's been the most important.